in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm really excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Emily Best. She's the CEO and founder of Seed&Spark. Emily, thanks so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Sure. My name is Emily Best. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And when I was little, the first thing I can remember telling people that I wanted to be when I grew up was an obstetrician.
Oh, wow.
And I said that because I really wanted to deliver babies. I had an amazing, he was an obstetrician and a pediatrician, very like town doctor. I grew up in Stockton, California in the 80s. And Dr. Rustaller was like 105 years old by the time he delivered me and continued to practice for like another 20 years. But I loved him and he was delightful and he was an obstetrician. So I wanted to be an obstetrician and I didn't know what all the sort of other implications of that were, but I would go around telling people that I wanted to be an obstetrician when I was like 5.
Oh my God, that's highly specific. I love it. And you fast forward to today, how do you think your personal journey has led you up until this point to found and be the CEO of Seed&Spark?
That's a really long answer and very odd. I went to college with the intention to be pre-med because I hadn't totally given up the idea of being some sort of doctor. And then I got to organic chemistry and I was like, nope. And honestly, I believe it's because the professor really prided himself on making it miserable for people to get through the subject matter. Yeah, it was really a bummer because I had a chemistry professor who, Eddie Luzik was a chemistry professor and a figure skater. And he would like demonstrate, I will never forget as long as I live, he demonstrated action potential by dropping into the splits on the floor in front of all of us at like 8:15 one morning. I was like, hey, Luzik, I will love chemistry for the rest of my life. And it was just such a contrast of like, what a great and inspired teacher whose role is to make people love it. And what a stodgy, angry, other kind of professor was to make people hate it. And he did, it worked. So I ended up studying anthropology, which was also really interesting to me. And by my senior year, I was really interested in this new thing called internet communities. We didn't have the term social media yet. And I wrote my thesis about how these internet communities were gonna move us from communities of interest to communities of practice. And it was allowing people to find shared value even at the margins. And I was really interested in like how these internet communities were empowering people at the margins to feel included. And I didn't actually make the connection to that part until right this moment. I was today years old when I made that connection to what I'm doing now. And then the first election I voted in was the Bush-Gore election that was decided by the Florida Supreme Court. And I was really disillusioned. And then 9/11 happened my senior year of college. And I was like, get me out of here. So I moved to Barcelona and I taught English and I studied at a jazz conservatory and learned what the world thought about Americans firsthand. And spent 5 years there, came back to the States, was working in restaurants when I left Barcelona, so came back and started running restaurants in California. When I was like 25, 26, I had 95 employees. I was running a $5 million business. And I started to get good at turning businesses around. So I would take a restaurant in the red and put it in the black through training. And it was training about what the job expectations are, how we treat people, how we treat each other, and how you can be expected to be treated by management, which if you don't own the restaurant can be really tough. So I would set all those expectations as the general manager, and then the chef would come in and throw plates at people's heads. So I didn't last long there. And then I decided, no, I really am going to go to medical school. So I quit the restaurant and I started waiting tables again to like maybe go back to school. And that just didn't happen. I was working odd jobs for a while, and had the opportunity to move across country to help my dad, who at the time was going through a really acrimonious divorce, just like try to get he ran his own business. And I just came across country to like try to help him get it back on its feet. He was really down. And I had this business operations experience. So I just, came to try to help him, and went to New York and was again working like a bunch of odd jobs, was helping my dad, I was waiting tables. I started to get into like theater and voiceover, and very long story short, I would produce a play in 2010. Like a bunch of stuff happened between I moved to New York and I produced a play, but like anybody who's been in theater in New York is like, I know what happened to you. If you start waiting tables at a restaurant, all your friends are actors, and pretty soon, if you have any business acumen, you're going to get turned into a producer. That's what happens. So I discovered producing because it felt like the confluence of creativity and business. And I would produce this play in New York, with this incredible actress named Caitlin Fitzgerald, who you might recognize as Tabitha in Succession now. And she was like at the beginning of a big upswing in her career. And we were producing a play called Hedda Gabler, which is a very, it's like Hamlet for women. It's the role every actress wants to play. And so in the evening, she was playing this incredible, juicy, meaty role where she was the star and the play was named after her character. And then during the day was being asked to audition for some of the biggest directors in independent movies, exclusively for parts like pretty girl, pretty girlfriend, pretty best friend, sexy best friend, hot fiance, on and on, right? And it was the first time. I was 30 years old. I think I turned 30 that summer. And I looked up at the big screen and I was like, oh, there's no women I admire or recognize. And what is that doing to us and to other women? And if I, as a middle-class white woman, do not feel represented on screen, or my experience is represented on screen, well, what does that mean for everyone else? Mm-hmm. And so that summer, we would decide to make a movie about female friendships. And it was my experience making that movie, the challenges and the opportunities, that led to founding Seed&Spark. Effectively, we would discover that the industry just didn't believe there was an audience for movies starring women that weren't about, women competing with each other for the affection of a man, or, being generally sexy as a primary mode of operating. And so we would make this movie, and I would learn a lot about the entertainment business, and I would get really interested in this incredible confluence in time that was crowdfunding had arisen out of the ashes of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Streaming just got, like, the broadband got big enough that you could really stream movies for the first time on your computer. This is like a funny thing. Canon, the camera company, had put a full frame sensor in the 5D camera, making digital cinema available to people. And these internet communities, now called social media, were all open social graphs. So you could reach really anybody you were even tangentially connected to. Right. And there was this like incredible moment in time, and like right around the 2010s, where creators were looking at each other being like, did they just give us all the tools we need? Right? So we launched Seed&Spark to try to help make all those tools accessible to the most diverse community of creators, people who are being left behind by this technology revolution because of broadband, because of lack of access to funding, or coming from under-resourced communities. And what we would build at Seed&Spark is a crowdfunding platform and an education program that led us to having the highest crowdfunding campaign success rate in the world and the most diverse pipeline of creators. And that was amazing. We get thousands and thousands of new stories told by creators who weren't getting a fair shake. And then around 2018, they came to us and they were like, we have a problem. We can't reach anybody who doesn't already look like us and already agree with us, because in the intervening years had come the great flattening and algorithmification of the internet. Right. And so everything that they were making was being delivered like a heat-seeking missile to people who already looked like them and already agreed with them. And that was not why they were making work. They were making work for representation to build empathy, to change people's minds and challenge their worldview. And that's not what the algorithms are built to do for you. So basically they came to us and they were like, figure out a way to deliver our content at scale to people who don't already identify as the audience for our work, but you can't use social media and you can't use streaming. And at that moment, I was like, I don't think we have a business. I don't really know what we're going to do here. And one of our advisors said, the workplace is the most diverse place most people are in their lives. I was like, how interesting. So we started reading the research on workplace culture and diversity and inclusion, because we were working in diversity and inclusion in the entertainment business. So like what was going on in the workplace. And around that time was when all of the big publications were like, D&I doesn't work. Like, in spite of the investment, it's broken and nobody likes it, and the content sucks. Like those were the big revelations coming out of the big consulting companies. And we were like, I'm not sure that that's what's going on. So we conducted our own research, and we interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of DEI leaders, consultants, L&D leaders, CEOs, anybody like building in public about company culture, academics. And we wanted to understand, with like a very express interest in what place do stories have in the workplace, a very express interest in understanding what the challenges are. And the truth was like massive underinvestment was the first and key problem. And the second was there's no universe in which a team of 2 or 3 people inside any size organization can combat structures of inequality on their own. That the responsibility for inclusion has to reach the very edges of the organization. It has to be a foundational job expectation for every single person in the organization. And organizations had a lot of ideas about what creates quote unquote belonging, but not a lot of actions around how to train those skills out to the edges of the organization. So you would onboard in a company and get like your little onboarding packet, and maybe you would go through like a static deck of some kind that's like
familiar
to do and not to do, maybe at the best, but there was no real skill building around how to treat your colleagues, how to cultivate belonging, how to hold yourself and others accountable. And so we thought, well, that's really interesting. And then every single person we talked to said, stories are the best tool we have to build empathy, but empathy is not enough. Empathy is only the trigger or the opening to behavior change. So how can we actually leverage empathy to drive behavior change? And that's what led us to build Film Forward. I told you it was a really long answer.
Incredible. No, I appreciate all the context. It's definitely a journey, and I feel like you're the ultimate multitasker, business operations, like based on all of these experiences as well. And hindsight is always 2020. So there is that common thread as well, and representation behind the camera, in front of the camera, we know is so important, especially with all of the content we have today, and creating meaningful connection in the workplace as well. You mentioned research, and I want to kind of dig into that further as well around the research you've done, hearing from partners around psychological safety. More and more folks are talking about it, and the quote unquote changing workplace. What have you been seeing there in the data?
Oh man. Well, so when we initially did our research, there are a few things that really stood out to us. And one was how common we heard folks talk about the broken paradigm of DEI training that was, let's get everybody in a room for a conversation, a hard conversation, a safe space, they might say. And inevitably what would happen is that the most marginalized in the room would be called upon to perform their trauma for their colleagues. Why? Because empathy is so important, right? And what would happen, the white or cis or straight or male, whoever the sort of dominant, group was, might have like an empathetic moment. Be like, oh, I empathized. I'm such a good person. Yep. And then they would leave the room being like, I'm such a good person. And they would go back to whatever microaggressive behaviors they might be performing, passing over people, not thinking about how their bias is involved in how they review or promote or hire, right? It didn't do shit, sorry, if I may, except make the marginalized folks feel like, well, once again, y'all have profited off of my emotional labor and I haven't been compensated for it. What else is new? And so it would create greater divisions. And it would basically teach the company that the burden of quote unquote fixing the problem was actually on the marginalized folks. And I would argue to some extent that like that's a challenge that we have to contend with around ERGs, because what you're basically doing is saying, hey, go take care of your own sense of belonging. And on the one hand, it is super important for people to be able to convene in what they actually feel like is a safe community and like build camaraderie and be told, no, you're not crazy, like you are being gaslit, whatever it is. And to be able to really group together, but you're also still effectively asking for volunteers in the marginalized communities who are disproportionately impacted by structural inequity in the organization to take responsibility for educating everyone else in the company about their own dignity, which is like not something we should need to have to advocate for, right? So I think we have to be really careful about when we talk about safe spaces, for example, the overall psychological safety of the organization and teams is really important to whether or not different tactics can be effective inside an organization. And psychological safety is made up of like some pretty tactical stuff that is often kind of overlooked when it comes to training. So, for example, being really clear about what your job expectations are and how you get evaluated, that contributes tremendous psychological. Feeling like you can flag an error of your own or someone else's without fear of being punished. Feeling like you are being, this relates to the first one, feeling like you're being evaluated fairly. Feeling like there's sort of broader sense of like being able to show up as your whole self, but basically means like I can surface my ideas and I feel heard in the space. I don't feel like they're stolen by other people. I don't feel like I'm talked over in meetings. Like there's some really basic tactical stuff that actually fosters a sense of psychological safety. And we looked a lot at the research of Project Aristotle that showed that psychological safety is the number one, the sort of leading indicator of efficient and high performing teams. And so that was really interesting as we were building Film Forward to think about how do we help measure as a baseline psychological safety? How do we measure against it over time as the program progresses? And how do we really help people build the skills of fostering psychological safety or advocating for their own psychological safety in the workplace?
Absolutely. I definitely agree that you need to think about this is from a business perspective, if you will, as well, and not think about this as just one person's job or just for managers as well, because in order for you to contribute ideas, feel like you're being heard and being seen by your teammates as well, it takes everybody to really build these skills and act upon them. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of measuring that psychological safety at work, how you kind of create that in the workplace and see like not seeing this as a destination to say, okay, we're psychologically safe, we don't need to be working on this
no
anymore.
This is always on. I just wanted to tell a quick story. As I was on the phone with a woman the other day who is she is a data scientist. She's currently working as a contractor for NASA. Real smart, real interesting, and happens to be a queer woman of color. And she said that her office mate, so this is not a manager, right? This is somebody who's an individual contributor as she is. Her office mate just regularly makes pretty casual racist and sexist remarks. And she gets gaslit about it. And she doesn't feel like she has a safe place to go. There's no framework for holding that person accountable, nor does she particularly feel safe going to her manager. And she's going to leave, and they're going to lose an incredible talent, not because a manager didn't do it right, but because there's no safe way for her to hold a colleague accountable for the impact of their actions that's negatively impacting her ability to safely work. So she just kind of doesn't go into the office. Like she knows she's supposed to now and again, but she just kind of doesn't anymore. She avoids it as much as possible. And she's thinking about like leaving that particular field for the moment.
Wow.
And I think about like, I could tell versions of that story like 1,000 more times, as I think most leaders in the DEI space can as well, and probably have experienced personally. That it's so disheartening that people will just exit an entire field. I talked to another woman the other day who had such a bad time in tech that she's leaving tech. I'm like, but we need you in tech. She's incredibly smart, like experienced growth marketer, which PS, those are hard to find, and ones that are good at it. She's like, no, I'm done with tech. I'm getting out of the business altogether. And I thought, the loss of productivity, the loss of talent is actually immeasurable, and that works against us, right? Because we can't ever quite quantify. We just know that it's billions and billions and billions of dollars, if that's how you want to count it. But more than that, it's just like wasted years of people's lives in agony and discomfort. And for what, right? For what? So when we think about psychological safety, the way that we measure it, we definitely mirrored some of the ways that Google Project Aristotle was thinking about it, measuring it. So we get a baseline for how confident people feel they understand the expectations of their role and their and the requirements to fulfill it, how comfortable they feel sticking up for colleagues, surfacing mistakes, making a mistake and not being unduly punished, being evaluated fairly for their job performance. And we get a baseline measurement, and then we do gap analysis, right? So then we look at, well, what groups are most psychologically safe in the company, and what groups are least psychologically safe in the company? Are there any patterns there that we could look at? Is it focused on one team or in one office or one organization? Is it focused? Is it usually the managers are the most psychologically safe? Like that's kind of more or less how it tends to work. But then who is? Is it individual contributors? Is it one race or gender? These are things that's really, really important to look at to understand like what is the spread, and think about really how to move the needle forward to impact that. And then we take the demographic and the baseline data that we have in each month of our engagement, where we're training around inclusive language, for example, or allyship behavior or accountability, and just like analyze all of the qualitative data we get in the course of people participating in the learning modules, to understand what are the suggestions being made by which groups, right? Are the suggestions that like surfacing suggestions from, for example, the least psychologically safe groups, to make sure that leadership is really paying attention to what they are saying, because they're going to have probably the best solves, right? They're in it, they're experiencing it every day, and they're thinking about, well, boy, if this were different, like that would sure make my life easier. That it sort of respects that the best information is actually at the edges of the organization. Leaders hate to hear that, but they should love to hear it. Like the best information is usually at the very edges of the organization. They understand what's happening at the point that basically the skin of the company, right? Between the internal workings and the world and the customers, and thinking about that interaction at the edges, what gets communicated, what doesn't, what's clear, what's not. We've had companies, for example, discover actually that just there's a bunch of benefits that the company offers that people had no idea about. Mm-hmm. And they were feeling really lacking in some resources. And the company was like, oh my God, we've been providing this for years. I can't believe they don't know that, right? So some of it is really just surfacing what are some of those like legacy structures that need to be updated, reworked, looked at, that can build tremendous efficiencies really quickly. And your employees will help surface that for you faster than if you were like trying to do it by yourself.
No, absolutely. I think the qualitative information, the anecdotes, the stories, the example you provided as well, and also the quantitative data of asking people how they feel, if they feel psychologically safe to provide their feedback, whether it's positive, negative, anything in between. And also if you're getting, a 90% positive rating on something, but 10% is super negative, if the 10% is from your least psychologically safe group, all of your women or people of color in the organization, that is not good. We need to continue to work on it. We brought up the term you brought up the term safe space a couple of times, and I just want to touch on, I know that we talked about the difference between brave spaces and safe spaces. Can you tell us why it's important to kind of really foster a brave space?
Yeah. So I learned this is not my term. I learned this from our co-heads of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Seed&Spark, Martina Potratz and Spencer Barros, who have been facilitating conversations inside some of the world's largest organizations for the last several decades. And they know this better than anyone. And they basically say, look, nobody can guarantee a safe space because I don't know the relationships between the people here, right? That could create a lack of safety. I don't know what the power dynamics are. And I don't know what somebody's going to pop off and do or say. So I can never guarantee a safe space. A brave space is typically one that has some ground rules that we're all agreeing to that allow someone to take greater risks in that space than they might. What's bravery? Bravery is just like risk in the face of fear, right? So how do we create the conditions for people to be able to be brave, take risks in spite of fear? And that means we have to set some parameters for what's the worst thing that could happen if you mess up in this space, right? We have to set some parameters for what's the worst somebody could do or say? What's the worst you could feel, right? So how do we deal with those things when they come up? And so a lot of it is just building ground rules that help people feel comfortable speaking. Okay, nothing that is said inside this conversation will be repeated or tweeted with attribution, and we're working towards harm, and here's how we take accountability, and here's a expert facilitator that can help us work through some of the harder stuff, these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think of the community guidelines on kind of social media groups and
that's right.
The frameworks for performance reviews or just giving or receiving feedback. I've heard a couple of those as well. So I think that definitely makes sense. When we're talking about folks who are within an internal organization and you're coming in and you're working with them and you receive feedback from them, can you share an example of something that anyone has said, after one of your educational workshops or films, knowing that that's a starting point as well, and they need to think about it and kind of act on that on their day-to-day?
Man, I have so many anecdotes. So one of my favorites, and this is it happened and it was a little bit too perfect. Nobody's this is the optimal scenario of how one person's experience of being asked to co-create an equitable environment can transform the lives of millions. And we did a learning module. It's our learning module on inclusive communication, but specifically, it features a beautiful short film featuring a trans actor. And then after each film, participants go through a set of open-ended reflections to unpack what they've watched, relate it to their lives, relate it to their workplace, and then start to think about their teams and their company's behaviors. And then they land on an action page that gives them tools and frameworks for understanding a little bit more, and then some skills to practice. That's what it is. So one of the people who participated in that learning unit said, this film had me really thinking about the experience of the trans and non-binary colleagues that I work with. And I talked to them, and it turned out some of them have not been enrolling in benefits because in our benefits onboarding, which is a legacy tool, it forces them to make a binary gender choice. They don't know what to put, and so they don't. And the VP of HR was in the room, was oh my God, what? Okay, I'll fix it. Well, fix it. That's ridiculous. That seems like a easy solve. Well, it turned out that was linked to their health insurance provider's system. And so they went to lobby the health insurance provider to change it. And that change would affect the millions of subscribers to that health insurance, right? So that's just one example of an employee given a little bit of stimulus starts thinking about inclusion a little differently than they were the day before. And they can surface things that are not even, quote unquote, intentional, right? They're oversights at best. they're part of legacy ways of thinking. There is so much thinking that has changed so fast about how organizations structure themselves, how they operationalize inclusion, that like every single organization, and I mean every single organization, no matter how progressive or on top of it or equitable they think they are, is going to have legacy practices that are exclusive, right? So you might try to build a really great workplace culture and still be demanding master's degrees in all of your job descriptions, right? Like there's always something to be unearthed, especially as the landscape changes. And so this is a way to have all of the employees kind of on the lookout, right? What are the pieces that we can change? It would be insurmountable for just one person or one team to try to take this on, or one leader, one CEO with all that a CEO has to do. It's really about creating a culture of co-creation of the inclusive environment. So that's one example. Another example, there's a personal example that I particularly love, which is we did a unit on well, it was really about immigrants. Like how do we think about immigrants in the workplace? And it was a film about the day in the life of an undocumented immigrant. And there were a couple of people afterwards who said, basically like, I've thought illegal aliens were always here to like steal our jobs and take our stuff. And I see how hard they work and how they're trying to build a better life for themselves. There was like a real deep moment of empathy. And that has me thinking differently about how I talk about it and how I treat them. And that was really powerful to me, because I think some of our greatest companies and triumphs, if we're going to do this, if we're going to evaluate all this in a business context, have certainly been started by immigrants. And the idea that, they get a hard time in the workplace is really painful to understand when there are so many other challenges in the way. So that's another example. I could do this all day, because this is what I do all day. We've just incredible examples of people surfacing. Here's my favorite. This happens all the time, so I'll generalize this because I don't want to call out any. I don't want to like call out any specific company here, but leadership constantly underestimates where employees are vis-a-vis the work of equity, right? So they're constantly sort of overestimating people's resistance to it, their maybe quote unquote kind of political stance around things. So after doing that unit on immigration, and they were really sensitive to what people thought, actually what came out of it was an overwhelming employee demand that the company take a stand on its interactions with ICE. And that employees felt like it was the responsibility of the company to take a really clear stand in support of immigrants and their safety. And that was not at all what leadership thought they were looking at. Similarly, we have companies who, for example, haven't really visibly or outwardly supported the LGBTQ community. And when we start doing education, the leadership gets really scared about what's going to happen. And the participants are like, oh my God, I love this. This is such a moving experience. It totally gets me thinking differently about how I'm going to treat my colleagues. But that's not just their LGBTQ colleagues. It gets them thinking more expansively about the scope of inclusion. And often it lets people see themselves as a part of the work in a more expansive way. So just focusing on sort of inclusion of one group as if the skills for inclusion don't actually improve the lives of literally everyone in the workplace, right? Like every single person's experience is improved if we resource everybody for the feelings of inclusion, right? Because like maybe you were born a white cis male and attributed all the quote unquote societal advantages, but you were born poor and you were the first person in your family to go to college, and it was a, state college because that's what you could afford putting yourself through school. And people are constantly, in hiring meetings throwing around like Ivy League this and Ivy League that, and it's really othering. And if people start to be conscientious of this, that guy too has a better experience at work, right? So that's why I think this work is so exciting, because like you're giving people an emotional and empathic stimulus, and then they get to be creative about how it's applied. And that, as far as we've seen, has like only created positive ripple effects.
Absolutely. It's positive ripple effects for everyone in the organization as well. And I think that stimulus part of all of the examples you shared were incredible. But that first one around health insurance is such a big deal too. So, and it affects so many people, and having the opportunity to say, hey, have a conversation with someone and make this huge change is so impactful as well. Emily, I want to ask, like, what do you think is the must-have organizations need to think about, incorporate into really operationalizing and building empathy into their organization, really understanding that's not, the starting and end point as well, but of course everyone's on a different journey, but an organization who really knows that it's an important skill to build across levels and departments.
So I have two answers to this question. And the first is still actually somewhat nascent for me. We're working on this now. The first is that I think organizations have to help people become aware of their own mindset.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want to do this work well, you really want people to be, I don't think it's like you need to push the feelings out of work or push the emotions out of work. I don't think it's that at all. I think people need to understand where their feelings are coming from.
Yes.
Right? What's motivating them? What makes them react really strongly, right? And that's a really core part of how we built Film Forward, is to give people a beat after this, like the emotional stimulus of a film, to like unpack what they have watched and relate it to their own lives and their own experience, to understand, well, where might these feelings be coming from, right? And that in and of itself is bias interrupting behavior. Mm-hmm. To have a really strong reaction and be like, I'm not going to talk immediately. I'm going to spend a minute, to think about, why am I having this reaction? And so part of it is like EQ, or empathy in general, is really about being aware of your own mindset and being open to other people coming from a different place and wanting to find a place of shared understanding. So I think that piece of it is really like helping people move towards a higher EQ. You don't just improve the workplace, like you'll improve everybody's lives, and they will be really grateful to you for that. Like
relationships.
Yeah. And I don't mean like put it like, yes, I think everybody should be in therapy, and I think we should all offer that as benefits. And yes, that's part of it. But I'm saying, like, actually, how does that show up? How does mindset and EQ show up in your everyday interactions? Mm-hmm. When somebody's like, I don't really like that idea, and another person is like, well, F you then, right? Like, it's like, what's happening there? Yeah, that we might be able to do differently or better. So mindset is the first piece. And the second piece, and I'm obsessed with this, is really a framework for accountability that everyone can count on. Because, and that to me is not different business or interpersonal. Right? If you make a mistake on a quote unquote sort of business front, you drop a ball with a client while you're on vacation and you didn't tell people and now they're mad at everybody, right? Versus you said something or did something interpersonally that made it really hard for a colleague to feel seen or appreciated, whatever. The process for accountability, that is allowing the person who experienced harm, or the team that experienced harm, to voice their real concerns in a like constructive way. When I say constructive, I mean in a way that is sort of formulated to be about, this was the actual impact of the actions, and for the person being held accountable to just be able to give a good apology. Mm-hmm. And then for them to know how to work together to repair. And repair is the ongoing behavior that demonstrates to everybody it is unlikely that this thing will happen again. Absolutely. Right? A one-time I'm sorry for a one-time microaggression is really not enough, right? There has to be like constructive behavior that both parties feel like makes it less possible for this to happen in the future. And that accountability framework has to be adopted throughout the entire organization. Because if ICs or middle managers feel like they can be held accountable in ways that leadership can't, well, it ain't going to work.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's the hardest part, because I think leaders have a really, really hard job. Managers have a really hard job. Existing in the pandemic is hard. Like everybody is having a really, really tough time. And some groups are way more adversely impacted in this time. But overall, everybody is, stressed out, burned out, struggling. And that's why mindset is so important, is to understand, like, am I upset about this thing, or am I upset about sort of
all of these things?
All of this. But also having a framework for accountability that people can count on, so that it is okay. It's not okay. Like once you make a mistake, you know how to repair it.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So that you're not worried that a mishap means you could be held disproportionately accountable to your colleague, for example, right? That's also part of psychological safety, right? Like I understand how to hold someone to account and be held accountable in a way that like keeps me in check. Like accountability is how we stay good. Like if you're in therapy, right? Your therapist is there to keep you accountable to your mental health. Like, I don't know if anybody has children, but your children certainly keep you accountable as a parent all the time to like, your job is to keep me alive and make me a good person in the world. And boy, they will challenge you on that all the time, but that's your job. That's the job you signed up for.
Absolutely. That mindset, internal work is really, self-awareness is super important. And then really engaging with folks and holding each other and yourself accountable, having that common language. Emily, is there anything that I either didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or 1 to 2 key insights you really want to underscore, bold, highlight that you hope people take with them after our?
Okay. I don't want you to think I'm sucking up to you, because that's not what's happening here. But I will say, I remember when we decided to have anonymous reporting at Seed&Spark, and how I felt in a small company, 16 people, and how that made me feel as the founder and CEO, that anything could be happening that nobody would be able to bring to me for any reason. And it took me a little while, but and the way that we structured it, because we're such a tiny company back then, was we had one of our external DEI advisors, checking in on it now and again, just to see if there's anything there, surface it. And I don't think anything has ever been reported in there. We're a really small company, but having it was really important to the overall psychological safety of our team. To know that there wasn't this pressure that like we're a family and like, you know what I mean? Like you should be able to tell us anything, like I don't know what could happen that somebody might not feel comfortable telling me. And I have to have the humility to allow them the space to find another way, if what I really want to do is be accountable as a leader at the end of the day to the psychological safety of the organization. And it makes me nervous every time we think about checking it. I'm like, oh God, what am I going to find out? Right. And the truth is, it makes people rely more on structures of real accountability, of like, hey, I need to tell you a thing and it's going to be uncomfortable. Right. And so I find that we've had a lot more productive, challenging, brave conversations, hard conversations, but that is more productive. And the Film Forward platform acts as sort of a second wave of that, right? Where we can provide this very specific stimulus and give people the opportunity to surface things in an anonymized way as well. And that really, I think that is a way to surface the insights that are hardest for leaders to hear, but the ones that they need the most. Mm-hmm. And that's not, it's like, yes, that is a huge part of reducing your overall business risk. But also, like, it is a part of organizational accountability that employees need to know and feel confident exists.
Absolutely. It's another way that people can psychologically, safely give feedback. And also it has to do with humility, personal experiences. It's about systemic changes and making people feel comfortable with the different ways they can share their lived and learned experiences. Emily, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I could talk to you
for having me
today, and I appreciate it.
Same.
And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the company to succeed overall. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.